Hello my creative friends, it's time to take another art break, and today we're going to be working on this cozy teacup that's filled with springtime pansies and a sweet little wren that's sitting right in the middle. Now I'm going to walk you through the steps, step by step, of how to do the watercolor, so even if you're a beginner painter, you too can create this. Pansies are a pretty easy flower to paint. Now for those of you who'd like to have a little help drawing, I do have a sketchbook membership. That's where I have all of the line tracers for any of the paintings I do on my channel, so then you can simply trace and then paint. You can get to the fun part if drawing's not your thing. But I will walk you through a few little simple ways of how you can break down the shapes of this and create your own if you'd like to try. Well, let's get started and create this happy little drawing of these springtime pansies and the sweet little wren. For the teacup shape, I was just drawing a classic teacup shape. I start with a U and then I do a gentle little slope at the top to create the top of the cup to make it look like it's going around. And at the base, I just do two little parentheses marks and then I follow whatever that base might be to create the shape. And then for the handle, I just do a simple little almost ear shape off to the side. Now let's work a little bit on the flowers. The front petal for the pansy is in the shape of an upside down heart, and then a tiny little teardrop shape in the middle. That's where your stamen of your flower is going to be. Now the petals on the off sides, they're going to be half petals coming up and over and just doing a little bit of ruffle on the edge. And then you'll have one in the back that connects the two, and that's your basic pansy shape. So the one that's inside of the cup, I'm doing a little bit inside, but it's still that upside down heart shape. And then I'll come into the middle and do the teardrop shape. Now I'm going to create those two petals that will go behind this one, so you can see they're half-shaped petals. And then the very one that goes behind connects those two. And that's it for the pansies. For the bird, I like to start with a shape that looks like a backwards L, and then for the head, I like to round it off at the top. For a little wren, a strong characteristic is to have those little tails that pop straight up in the air. If you have that little tail that goes straight up, it's going to look like a wren. And then those little side wings come past the little tail and around. You're going to want to put a little round eye a little ways back, and then make a long beak off the front. And then it's going to look like a wren. Once you have your wren all put inside of there, then you can add the filler leaves and any other little small flowers you would like to. If you want to have the tracer and you'd like to go ahead and trace and paint, go ahead and check out my membership. It's very reasonably priced and I so appreciate all those who support my channel that way. Well, let's go ahead and get started with the watercolor steps next. For this painting, I'm using the Arches 100% cotton watercolor paper, and that's going to make a difference in some of the watercolor blending you'll see happening. First, I'm going to use just a clear water and paint in the petal I want to put the first color on. I choose the front one and I'm just using a very light, almost probably tea consistency of the color and putting my color on, and then I'm coming in with just a little bit more pigment. I'm taking it directly out of the box, adding a little bit more water. I'm about probably milk consistency, and I'm tapping that close to that little teardrop shape. And because that paper is already wet, it's going to draw that darker color out into that lighter color, and it does create a really interesting look. I'm going to do that same thing at the top. I'm going to choose the purple one at the very top, paint it in first with the water, and then now using the light color and then tapping in that dark, and you're going to see that paint kind of move out. It kind of depends on the amount of pigment that's in each colors if you see such a strong reaction. But this violet color does have very much a strong reaction, and you're going to see that color just move so much quicker. Now with watercolor, if you want to keep your colors separate, you need to work in spaces individually and give your paper time to dry in between your color. So now I'm moving to more of the yellow area, and I did the same thing. I started with the water first, then put in my lightest area and then tapped in a darker shade of yellow, highly concentrated in color, and it should do the same thing as the purple. It'll move out into those lighter areas. When painting the pansies, you definitely want to make sure you're painting around that little teardrop area because we want that to remain that bright yellow look, and you're going to need to have white paper underneath there. So as long as your water isn't touching into that area, that center will stay bright white. Watercolor only wants to flow where the paper is wet, so if that center area remains dry, that paper will stay white. The other tip I wanted to give people is that watercolor dries lighter. So what you see when it's wet won't look that way as it dries, and you're going to need to put multiple layers of paint on to get your watercolor to look like it has more depth. So definitely start light and then work your way dark. With watercolor, you're always painting the shadows. It's just the opposite of what acrylic paint is. With acrylic paint, you start dark and then work your way light, but watercolor is just the opposite. So you can see how I laid in that light shade of purple, tap in the deep shade of concentration of purple, and let my colors kind of blend and flow together. Since I have some areas already wet on my pansies, I want to switch and do some of the leaves. But I want to choose areas that aren't touching the areas that are already wet, or my green is going to move into my pansy. And I actually do that with one of my pansies. I do go in a little too early, and I'll show you how that green kind of just seeps into the purple. I can't stop it. It's going to happen, but I can show you how you can try to fix it if it happens. This is the leaf where I rushed the process too quickly and I've gone in too soon, and my paper in that purple area is still too wet. And when I put that green in there, my color just naturally floats down into that purple because the paper's still wet there. So I rinse my brush out with clean water, give it a squeeze, and then try to go in and lift some of that color out. That's about all I can do. And then I need to just wait until it dries and perhaps add a little bit more purple over the top to see if I can camouflage it. But my best advice is to dry your paper if you need to with like a heat tool or a hair dryer completely before you begin your next layers if you don't want your colors to accidentally run into each other. This painting is fairly small, but I wanted it to fit on a square card that I already purchased at Michael's at one time. They're a square, and I really do like painting in a square shape, so my painting is fairly small. And because my painting is fairly small, I'm using a round brush, a number 6 Princeton Velvet Touch brush. They're one of my favorite watercolor brushes. They're fairly inexpensive and they really do last you a long time. So I do have some links inside of my description box of some of the items I use if you're interested in checking them out. Since my painting up above was fairly wet, I decided to move down and work a little bit on the teacup. For the inside of the teacup, I wanted more of just kind of a slight wash of color. So I took some of my golden colors and a little bit of brown and mixed my own kind of a dirty golden-y color. Might be a good way to explain it. I wanted it to be kind of neutral and not really a super strong background for the teacup because I wanted to be adding those little extra details around it and on that top. So I didn't want that background color to interfere too much with what I was going to be putting on top. When I drew the teacup, I wanted it to have kind of a folk art style to it, so I designed it to look like it had needlepoint pattern on the front. So the flowers have kind of more of an angular feeling, and I do have a few little hand-stitched look kind of marks on the front, and I thought it really lent itself well to this painting. On the teacup is where I added a little bit more teal color to this. I do love that color where you mix some of that bright green and blue together to come up with a real pretty teal look. But first I painted it all that more of that little wash color first, and then I layered my colors on the top. Whatever underneath will affect the colors that you put on top, but adding that neutral color underneath there first adds kind of an aged feeling to this painting. When deciding on what color to paint the pansies, I did a Google search on what colors pansies come in, and I was so surprised in how much a variety there really is in pansies. But I decided to stick with more of the traditional color of the purple and the gold. The only thing I did was switch it up just a little bit, so one was all purple and then added a little bit of the golden color on each one in the background and in the foreground. And that's how I changed it up. But take a look and see all the great colors that pansies come in. It's a wonderful little happy flower for springtime. At this stage, my flowers have had plenty of time to dry, so I'm going to be laying in the next petal colors. Again, I'm starting with the clear water, then laying in my lightest color that I'm using, and then tapping in that dark centers. If you're fairly new to watercolor, you may be using a student grade watercolor paper, which means that there's a size that's inside of the watercolor paper and less cotton. With this paper, there's a lot more cotton, so your paper's going to stay wet longer. It absorbs the pigments quite differently than what a paper will when if it's a student grade paper. But all that being said, you can still get a similar look. You just need to add just a tiny bit more water. And I like to say if you kind of tickle your colors together, put your colors down and then kind of tickle with your brush, brush those colors together, and you can get a little softer look. I also wanted to point out, if you're new to doing watercolor, this style of painting is more of an illustrative style, and I'm wanting to keep my colors separate. So in order to help myself do that, I'm making sure I'm putting on my individual areas, making sure that they're drying, and then adding the next layers on. So I'm painting my pieces kind of like a puzzle. I'm starting with the one piece, letting them dry before I move to the other. Now it's okay if my colors blend somewhat, that's fine, and that looks great. That's kind of a watercolor look. But if I want to keep more distinct areas and not have all of my colors blend together, I need to give that dry time in order to keep my colors separate. At this stage, my flowers are pretty much done, and so are my leaves. I'm going to give them plenty of time to dry and then come back and add those next layers. As I watch my paint dry, I'm going to see how much more color I need to add. Now this is where I'm adding a little bit of the teal, and I'm going right over that neutral color down below, and it just adds a little bit more of an antique feel to the teal. In the end, I'll make sure I have a darker shadow on the inside of the handle and a little bit more down at the bottom, because that would all be in shadow. On the yellow flowers, instead of tapping in a darker shade of purple, I tapped in more of that golden color right at the base, and I do just kind of tap just ever so tiny on the one that's in the foreground, a tiny bit more of that darker yellow on the outside of the petals to give it a little bit more interest. Here I'm adding a little bit more of that teal from down below. I'm mixing it with a little bit more green, and then I'm tapping it in. It's a great idea when you're doing the leaf work is to change up your color of green just to give it a nice variety. Now it's time to go ahead and paint those small little details on the cup. I'm still using my number 6 brush, but I could have easily bumped down to a smaller brush, and that might have been more helpful. I have a little mini brush set that I use that I bought it at Menards, I think is where I bought it at. But they're very small mini brushes, and I do end up using those at the end to add just some smaller little details. You could also put these in with micron pens if you decided you wanted to use that and you had a little bit more control. You could use a set of markers or something like that as well. Now we're finally getting to that little bird on the inside. My flowers are completely dry, and so are the greens. So now I'm going to be working a little bit on that little wren bird in the background. You can kind of see from my color swatch card that I have up above. I worked on a piece of paper and kind of set up an idea of perhaps maybe 3 different colors that I would use. A light tan, a medium rust, and then a little darker rust color as well. Wrens kind of come in that color, so I was just tapping in little bits of color and then letting the color and the watercolor paper work together and blend on its own. I'm going to leave some bright white of the paper showing around the eye. If you do that, it just always kind of brings to life those little birds if you have just a little bit of white, bright paper all the way around that eye. This is another area to go ahead and take your time and build your colors slowly. Start with the lightest color on the chest and then work darker as you go back toward that tail. That'll give your little bird a little bit more dimension. Make sure you're not losing all the light color. It's easy to do when they're so small, but start light on the breast especially, and then move a little bit darker as you go to the back and build your colors slowly. To add a little bit more interest into this little bird, once it's all dry, I'm going to be using my micron pen and adding just the slightest bit of tick marks on the body and on the wings to give it even more of a feather feel to this little birdie. This is one of the little mini detail brushes that I used to create the patterns on the front of the cup, and I also used it to create the little line work that's inside of the pansies. I'll have a link down inside of the description box if you'd like to check them out. When using these little mini brushes, it does work well to dip them in the paint, but then when you twist it inside of the paint, like you're laying it a little bit flat, twisting it around itself and then pull it out, and then you're going to get a nice little point, and that's going to work perfect to add these small little bits of line work to your painting. Now this is the area of the painting that I got really kind of bold and crazy. I decided I wanted to add just a little bit of purple inside of those yellow areas because many of the pansies do have those bright yellow flowers, the petals, but they're purple on the inside. And I know purple and yellow are complementary colors and they're probably going to make a brown color, but I wanted to give it a try. So when you're painting the yellow, you might want to leave it a little lighter towards the center if you want to add that bright purple centers. I wish I would have kind of went a little lighter on my yellow to see if that might have made a difference. They did kind of slightly turn a little bit brown, especially on that back one, but in the end I think it still looks great, and I think it looks really kind of fun to have that little burst of purple inside of the yellow. I added the next layer of color to my bird, and then I'm adding just a little bit more darker purple to my flowers. It looks dark now because it's wet. It's going to dry lighter. I decided to add a little bit of a shadow area underneath my cup so it wasn't floating. I'm going to be adding a little bit more creative background before I get finished, but this is just the beginning stages for my background. I was going to be using a micron pen in a very small nib size, about a 0.1, to add the little details to the eye, making sure I leave a little catch light inside of there. Every living thing has a catch light, so if you have that little bright area of white paper amongst the black, it's going to bring your little bird to life. I'm also going to be using this small little nib size to do a few little feather strokes along the breast, a little bit on the wing, and on the tail. And just those little tiny details is going to bring a lot of interest to this little bird. Now this painting developed in stages, and first of all I thought all I was going to do was ink the edges and call it good. But once I finished the inking, it just didn't seem finished to me, so I'm going to be adding a little bit of stamping in the background with a nondescript kind of writing stamp that I have, and then splash in a little bit more aging color to the background to give this painting a little bit more vintage feel. Now that my card is finished, I needed to seal it first before I attached it to the card, and I used a couple layers of the Rust-Oleum clear matte varnish to go over the top. I glued my card down using the Gorilla Glue. This is the Arches watercolor paper. It's 100% cotton, so I like using the spray glue the best to be able to adhere my card down. Well, let's take a look at what this looks like in the studio amongst some of the other paintings I've created so far this spring. For the month of April, we concentrated on creating this baby farm animal series, and they're all so adorable. For the month of May, we're going to be working a little bit more on some flowers. So if you enjoy creating whimsical style paintings, come on over to my channel. I'd love to have more creative friends join me. Leave me a comment, give me a thumbs up. It really does help YouTube push my videos out there. As a matter of fact, YouTube thinks you might be interested in watching this video. You might want to click it and check it out. Well, thanks for joining me today, and hopefully you'll come back and join me again, and perhaps next time you'll paint right along with me.